Have you ever wondered why Florida, with its Spanish-sounding towns and odd place on the map, isn't still a part of Spain? The answer is stranger than most realize. This was once a lawless Spanish peninsula, a haven for escaped slaves, Seminoles, and pirates caught in a tug-of-war between empires. Borders changed hands through forgotten treaties, brutal wars, and a $5 million deal that redrew the destiny of America. Yet the story of why Florida became American, and not Spanish or even British, still shapes the country's identity today. If you think Florida's past is just beaches and oranges, you're missing the secret history behind the border that changed everything. So, what really happened on this haunted edge of America? Juan Ponce de Leon stepped ashore in 1513, planting Spain's flag on a wild peninsula that would never quite fit the empire's mold. He wasn't searching for the fountain of youth, that story came later, but for gold, land, and royal favor. Spanish officials named the place La Florida, but their grip was always tenuous. The peninsula's tangled forests and swamps proved impossible to tame, and waves of Apalachee, Timucua, and later Seminole resistance kept Spanish settlements on edge. Over 2 centuries, the colony became less a jewel and more a liability. Yet in 1738, something remarkable happened. Governor Manuel de Montiano signed a charter for Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, just north of St. Augustine. This became America's first free black town, built by more than 100 people who had fled slavery in the British colonies. Fort Moses residents farmed, defended the border, and forged a new kind of freedom under Spanish law. With indigenous groups and maroon communities blending on the frontier, Florida turned into a haven for those escaping the reach of English planters. For Spain, this fragile claim was both shield and invitation, a borderland promising liberty but always threatened by rival empires and the ambitions of the enslaved and the free. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris handed Florida from Spain to Britain, and overnight the peninsula changed hands. British governors arrived with grand plans, new land grants for loyalists, dreams of plantations, and promises of order. But the reality was anything but stable. British rule turned Florida into a magnet for outlaws. Smugglers slipped through the inlets, trading rum, guns, and enslaved people far from the eyes of customs officials. Amelia Island and the backwaters near St. Augustine became notorious for their contraband markets. Naval officers, promised a cut of confiscated goods, tried to clamp down, but the coastline was too long and the profits too tempting. Meanwhile, escaped slaves and restless Maroons found new cracks to slip through, as British authorities struggled to patrol the border. Florida's ports saw more illegal cargo than legal trade, and the line between merchant and pirate blurred. By the time the British lost Florida in 1783, the territory had become less a crown jewel and more a regional headache, an outpost where law, loyalty, and profit rarely lined up. Andrew Jackson crossed the border with more than 3,000 troops, determined to strike deep into Spanish Florida. His column moved fast, torching Seminole villages that dotted the Apalachicola and Suwannee rivers. Within days, his men stormed the Spanish fort at St. Mark's, claiming it as a base. Seminole leaders scattered into the swamps, but Jackson's campaign pressed on. He sent patrols through tangled forests, capturing supplies and rounding up anyone suspected of aiding resistance. By late May, his forces reached Pensacola, the capital of West Florida. Spanish troops withdrew without a fight, and Jackson's men marched in, raising the American flag over the fort. In just a few weeks, he had seized 2 key Spanish strongholds and shattered Spain's control in the region. What began as a border raid now looked more like a full-blown occupation. Word of the executions reached London before it hit Washington. British officials demanded answers, insisting that two of their citizens had been hanged and shot by an American general on foreign soil. Lord Castlereagh's protest landed on John Quincy Adams's desk with a warning. British honor was at stake. In private, Castlereagh weighed war, but British merchants pressed for calm. Trade with the U.S. was booming, and few wanted another conflict across the Atlantic. Still, the British ambassador called the executions an outrage against the law of nations. Inside the White House, Monroe's cabinet fractured. John C. Calhoun and William Crawford pushed for a public rebuke of Jackson, arguing he'd gone rogue and risked dragging the country into war. Adams stood alone defending Jackson's campaign as a necessary act of self-defense. Cabinet meetings stretched for hours, tempers flaring as each man calculated the price of backing down or doubling down. Spanish diplomats suspended talks, and British officials let it be known that they would not forget. For Adams, the uproar became leverage, a crisis to be managed, but also a bargaining chip as the U.S. pressed its case for Florida. John Quincy Adams picked his moment. With headlines in London raging over Jackson's invasion and the executions at St. Mark's, Adams sat down to draft his reply. He didn't apologize. Instead, he turned the uproar into leverage. Spain had suspended talks, hoping outrage would force the United States to back down. But Adams saw an opening. In his notes, he pressed the point. Spain lacked control. British protests rang hollow, and the U.S. had acted because no one else would. Every letter, every cabinet argument became a chess move. While Luis de Onís pleaded for delay, Adams countered with new demands, hinting that American patience was running out. The crisis that threatened negotiation now became its fuel as Adams pushed the boundary further with every diplomatic exchange. Spain signed away Florida in 1819. The United States took possession, promising to cover $5 million in American claims against Spain. In return, Spain kept Texas, at least for now. John Quincy Adams drew a new border from the Gulf to the Pacific, stretching American territory farther than ever before. The old Spanish line vanished from the map. In 1819, the Adams-Onís Treaty transferred Florida from Spain to the United States in exchange for $5 million in settled claims and a formal border with Spanish Texas. This single document redrew the map, not just for Florida, but for the entire Gulf Coast. Evidence from Spanish charters, British treaties, and U.S. military records shows how Florida shifted from a neglected outpost to a strategic prize shaped by conflict, diplomacy, and the resistance of Seminoles and free black communities like Fort Mose. Yet, key details about indigenous negotiations and some border surveys remain lost or classified in archives. Today, Florida's Spanish place names, multicultural heritage, and unique geography reflect this layered past. The peninsula's journey from Spanish colony to U.S. state demonstrates how a forgotten border deal shaped American expansion and left a legacy still visible on every map and street sign.